Hello, everyone. This is your host, Isabella Murner, and you're listening to the Music Appreciation Podcast on National Public Radio. If you're a regular listener, I'd like to thank you for your support. And if you're a new listener, thanks for listening. I release a new music appreciation podcast weekly. If you like what you hear, go ahead and listen to last week's podcast, in which I discuss the style, instruments, and composers of the medieval time period. Now grab a cup of tea, sit down, and cozy up, because I've got a good one for you today. We're going in detail on a topic that not many people know much about. The Renaissance era was a time period in which the arts flourished. Whether it be writings, paintings, sculptures, or music, all of it played a part in developing society's perception of the arts. The artists of this era focused on humanism and the revival of ancient Grecian and Roman styles. This influence reached throughout history, even today. While the Renaissance period was focused in Europe, its reaches spread much further with the increase in trade and the invention of the printing press. Historians agree that the era began with the end of the medieval time period around 1400 and ended around 1600 with the beginning of the Baroque era. In all, the Renaissance period lasted about 200 years, which means there are tons of musical impacts that occurred in the time period. And that's the topic of our podcast today: how music affected the time period that was the Renaissance. We can thank the invention of the Gutenberg press for the increase in the popularity of music. Its influence allowed music to be distributed to a much greater audience. On top of that, a strengthening economy meant thousands of musical artists were able to afford the training in which they wouldn't have otherwise. Because of the increasing availability of printed music, educating musicians became more and more accessible to those without exorbitant amounts of money. And because of this growth in musical access, secular forms of music began to flourish. Forms such as chanson and madrigal grew more popular, and so the use of music for entertainment purposes rather than just religious worship meant wealthy nobles began to commission and employ artists. The interest in secular music led to the development of the polyphonic style. This is the style that incorporates multiple melodies that play as one. But enough of that style. Let's talk about the artists themselves. Despite what most people think, some of the most well-known influencers, such as Mozart and Bach, did not live to see the Renaissance period. However, composers such as Giovanni Palestrina, Thomas Tallis, and William Byrd can be credited for setting the stage for these well-known artists. These musicians of the Renaissance are often overlooked, but they actually had a great influence on the development of music. Because of them, Mozart and Bach were able to change the music world and begin the transition into the music we know of today. For example, Giovanni Palestrina, an Italian composer, had hundreds of compositions, including 104 masses, 64 offertories, more than 300 motets, 72 hymns, 35 magnificats, and many more. He was born February 3, 1525, in Palestrina, and he died at the age of 69 on February 2, 1594, in Rome. In his lifetime, he accomplished much. He had an interest in music that is almost unmatched. He spent most of his life in Rome composing, playing, and teaching music. He was incredibly talented. So much so that his first published work, a book of masses, impressed Pope Julius III enough to appoint him musical director of the Julian Chapel. In his life afterwards, he held many positions similar to this at other chapels and churches, as he was mainly a religious composer. In the end of his life, he returned to Julian Chapel to work and remained there in his life after, and he remained there until his death. Unfortunately, in the later years of his life, the plague took his brother, 2 of his sons, and his wife, which seemed to result in a depressive period. That halted the compositions. Fortunately, he married again. His new wife, who was a widow, was incredibly wealthy, which allowed him to compose many pieces until his death. Although he did not know it in his lifetime, he was the most famous 16th century representative of the Roman school of music composition. In addition, he had an incredible influence on the development of Roman Catholic Church music, and his work is viewed as a perfect example for Renaissance polyphony. If we look into the components of Renaissance music, Giovanni Palestrina, as well as other artists, we can see different types of instruments used at the time. While vocal music was considered far more important at the time, instruments were still a major part in the development, style, and performance of the pieces in this era. Some of these instruments we still use today, but others have lost popularity and are remembered only in memory of the Renaissance. A wider variety of instruments were used due to the increase in access to music, so we can separate them into categories. Of the brass instruments used, the slide trumpet, which is similar to a trombone, the trumpet we know of today, and the cornet were used. Cornets are no longer used today, but they were long tubes of varying length, used in the way one would play a recorder. String instruments were popular at the time and used in both religious and secular musics. The viol, the lute, and the lyre were incorporated into many works in this era, although only one is used today, the viol. The viol had 6 strings and would play with a bow. Today it's commonly known as a viola. The lute, however, more closely resembles a guitar, but the strings were normally plucked at the neck rather than at the body, as they were in the guitar. Lastly, the lyre can be seen as a small harp, sort of, and is played the same way. The last category of instruments we discuss is percussions. Percussion instruments weren't as well used in the Renaissance era as they are now, and so there isn't a wide variety of instruments that they chose from. Of the instruments they did use, there was the triangle, the tambourine, and the Jewish harp. The Jewish harp, however, fell out of popularity as it was banned. It was made of silver and was banned to a great rise in demand for the metal, which is kind of odd, but yeah. The combination of vocal music, instrumentation, and an increased availability in musical education allowed many artists to make their mark. The rise in popularity of this creative outlet led to the creation of many amazing works, one of which, L'Homme Armé Super Voces Musicales by Josquin de Prez, is among the most remembered. This piece uses a formal pattern of the mass form, yet its intricate melodies differentiate from other mass songs of the time. The song was meant to pay homage to an earlier artist known as De Fay, and because of the focus on vocal music at the time, it uses no instruments, only singers. In addition, this song is a perfect example of the polyphonic style I mentioned earlier in the podcast. Going back to Giovanni Palestrina, we can look at one of the Italian composer's most famous pieces, Santa Mater. Originally, this piece was composed with the use of 8 voices in mind, but throughout the years, artists have incorporated greater or fewer numbers in their performances. Similar to Josquin's piece, the work of Giovanni Palestrina only uses vocal music with no instrumentals in sight. This work of music is a great example of a motet, and it perfectly portrays the essence of Renaissance-era music. The atmosphere the pieces like these portray is like no other, and just by listening to them you can get a feel of what it was like to go and listen to these composers' music in the Renaissance era itself. If you have time, I highly encourage you to listen to some of these works after the podcast. It's worth your time. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, folks. I hope you liked learning about Renaissance music, the artists, instruments, and styles involved. I find the topic immensely interesting, and I hope all my listeners do too. If not, at least you got a fun little history lesson. You now know the details about a topic that not many people learn about. Now go brag to your friends about what you learned. If you like this podcast, join us next week when we talk about the Baroque period and the styles, instruments, and artists involved. This has been Isabella Murner on the Music Appreciation Podcast. Thanks for listening. See you next time.